Okay, so we're facing another week of intense power cuts, with the President confirming in his weekly letter this morning that there is no quick fix for load shedding. There are many reasons why power utility Eskom is facing such a crisis. Years of poor political and managerial decisions, corruption, skills loss, sabotage, with strong calls as well that both the board of Eskom and top management should be given their marching orders. Well, let's understand a little bit more about the role and responsibilities of the board and executive management, particularly at an SOE. I'm joined now by Professor Alex van den Heever of the Wits School of Governance. Prof, thank you so much for your time. First, some basics. What is the difference between the role of the board and the role of executive management at a company? Why do we need both?
So you definitely need both, and part of an important issue is to understand what a board is. And it's intended in all designs to solve what's called a principal-agent problem. And that is where the people who potentially own or are affected by an organization are so disaggregated that they require a kind of a forum or a structure to effectively aggregate their interests in the localized supervision of any kind of entity, whether it is private or public. And what we have are public companies where you'll see that boards are essentially established to protect shareholders in general and their interests in relation to management. And management, the risk is in this relationship is that management may run away with your money, quite simply. And so the idea is really that the principal represented by the forum, the board, oversees management. But in essence, the management exercises day-to-day control over the organization, but the localized supervision is provided by the board, which makes sure that the management actually performs its functions both strategically and operationally in accordance with the interests of the principal. Now, the problem with state-owned enterprises is that government has assumed that it, as the shareholder, is somehow the principal or reflects all the interests of the principal. But when it's so aggregated, the question of the relationship between the board and the management of a state-owned enterprise is really quite confused. And I think there's a big discussion about our corporate governance designs.
Yeah. Let me just see if I'm understanding this correctly. So the board is a bit of a watchdog to make sure that the people running the place, the executive management, don't do things that are not in line with the law and how it should be. But they're also representative in a way of the shareholder. So we know that government's the shareholder at our state-owned enterprises, but in a way, aren't we all shareholders as members of the public? And shouldn't the board be there to protect our interests? But it doesn't work like that?
Yes, it doesn't. And so the problem is that the shareholder in this instance, in accordance with the Memorandum of Incorporation in the case of Eskom, is all those rights are essentially vested in a Minister of Public Enterprises, which is a single person. And essentially what you want is we as the public need to be protected against other people who might run away with our money, which is the people in the executive of government. So when you establish a board, you have to establish a board that represents society's interests, because Eskom effectively impacts on everybody, rich, poor, companies, etc. And the question is whether the board and the legislative framework that currently exists for SoEs, and in particular Eskom, actually reflects that relationship. Who protects us from the executive running away with our money? Now, this is the executive of government, because all those rights and the rights to interfere in the performance of state-owned enterprises are essentially allocated to a politician, which is a huge concentration of power. And the very idea of the solving the principal agent problem is basically to establish a coherent separation of powers to ensure that everybody stays in their lane and does what they're meant to do. And this is what a board and management should be sort of structured to do. It doesn't appear to be the case in the case of Eskom.
So is it possible to have a highly effective, functional executive management team despite a poorly constituted or a half-constituted board? Because there have been problems with the fact that the board is not fully put together at Eskom.
Yeah, so it's quite possible that you could have a coherent arrangement established, but it'll largely be a discretion of the member of the executive, in this case the minister. It will be a discretion. They also have a discretion to do bad things if they wish, which is what we've seen in the past. But there is also the issue as to whether or not both the board and the chief executive also have the required decision space to do their job properly. And this is also a problem of design, is the whole idea of creating autonomous organizations and institutions is to give them the power to actually run their ship. They must sail their ship, there must be a single captain of the ship, and you have a forum and a structure, a board that is, by the way, not only overseeing what people are doing, but it is integral to the strategy that is developed by that organization, which means it doesn't do the day-to-day, but it is integral to developing coherent strategies. But they must have the powers to do so. When I look at the relevant legislation, the powers to interfere in that are centralized. The powers are not allocated completely to the organization, which means there's lots of scope for interference in this organization. Even when it's not for corrupt purposes, it also impacts on efficiencies and how they would actually carry out their operations and make discretionary decisions that is consistent with their mandate, which is meant to be very explicit, which is I think basically the structure, the governance framework doesn't match their ability to carry out the mandate. So it's quite possible for a very effective team to be hamstrung. It is also quite possible for a team to be structured that is still reasonably coherent despite the weaknesses in this framework I've described.
Okay, so I mean, you make an interesting point. I mean, this is totally separate from what we saw happen to boards through state capture, where it was a concerted policy to infiltrate boards, put people in place who are pliable, open to corruption, and off you go. This is different. You're talking about structure. You're talking about issues around the way the boards are constituted, too much concentration of power, too much possibility just to meddle and perhaps prevent efficiency. So I'm going to ask you the big question now. There have been so many calls for the management team at Eskom, Andre de Ruyter and his C-suite to go. There have also been calls that the board needs to go. Do you have a view on their functioning? When you look at how they're doing their business or trying to do their business, do you tend to go, yeah, they're actually not doing a good job? Should one go? Should both go? What's your view?
So my sort of opinion at this point would be, based on what I've seen, is that you have to allow this team to get on top of these problems, and that requires a degree of continuity. I think that the danger that exists from the structural weaknesses I've pointed out is that it is eminently possible for Eskom to be recaptured at very short notice. It isn't necessarily at this point, but I think that what you're seeing is a lot of the calls for the removal of the board and the removal of the chief executive are potentially part of the group that want to recapture Eskom and all that goes with that. But that talks to the vulnerability that would be killed if there was a proper structure, corporate governance structure around Eskom. And what it's done is it's actually intensified the attempts to interfere in Eskom because of all of these structural weaknesses. You just have to change the minister and you have a massive problem on your hands. You have to change the president who can change the minister and you have a massive problem on your hands. So I think that this is part of the weakness. We basically created an unsafe organization from a corporate governance design, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the current team is problematic. I think that what we need to do now is, in the medium term, we need to change the corporate governance design. But over this period, we need to allow this team to carry on and get on top of these issues. And government also needs to get out of the way of the issues that on the production side of energy that government has been standing in the way of. They have tended to be the problem that is stood in the way of Eskom being able to achieve certain of its objectives. That needs to be understood better and better, and then we can move forward. But I think we have severe governance problems we've got to resolve, but that's not necessarily the cause of what this team is doing. But there's a danger that the team could be changed at short notice and it could be highly destructive.
Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Very interesting perspective on how boards function, particularly state-owned entities, boards and management, and how they work together. That was Professor Alex van den Heever of the Wits School of Governance. Let's now